Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of Movement Fix Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan DeBell. This episode, there's no guest. It's just me talking solo about squatting and different stances. And really what I want to get into in this episode and the purpose behind making this episode is to talk about why I think people disagree about the stance that people should use in squatting. Now, a lot of times people will argue and argue and argue, but I think that there's a higher level question that we need to think about that will make a lot of these other questions dissolve. So that is what I'm going to discuss in this episode. But before we get into it, I have a couple of announcements. Number one, this Friday, which would be July 10th, I'm releasing on themovementfix.com the first of many very long and detailed resources / article / blog post. And this particular one is basically, I'm trying to take everything out of my head and that I use and that I think about in regards to hip mobility and making it available as a resource. So from the anatomy of the joints to the way things sort of move together to the anatomy, the muscular anatomy, and the concepts behind why you would do certain things to improve range of motion versus others, as well as full video tutorials of my favorite drills for each movement, so each direction that the hip could go in. So you could find that at themovementfix.com. I will make it very easy to find as it's a new thing, so I'll highlight it on the website. So that's thing number one. Thing number two is our version 2.0 of our hip and low back mobility self-care program will be available next Wednesday, July 15th. We're very excited. I'm very excited. I've been working on this the entire quarantine, using the feedback of everybody who has gone through, who gave us their feedback, who's gone through this program to try to make it better and more easy to use and effective and enjoyable to go through. So basically what this program is 10 to 15 minute sessions that are specifically designed to help you take your hip and your low back through all the different ranges of motion it can go in and build strength in specific areas with specific exercises to help you maintain and improve the health and range of motion of your hips and low back. So that will be available next Wednesday at themovementfix.com under programs version 2.0. I think you guys will really enjoy it. I dedicated so much time and energy into trying to make it as easy to use and enjoyable to use as possible. So that is coming soon. Hey, if you guys didn't know, if you're listening to this podcast on iTunes and you like watching videos of podcasts, these podcasts are now also on Movement Fix's YouTube channel. So if you just go to youtube.com and search for Movement Fix, you can find these videos on the channel. So right now I'm recording a video. So some of you are watching this on YouTube and it's very obvious that I'm recording a video. But hey, maybe you like watching those better than just listening. So that option is available. And I've also been doing that for about the last 5 episodes with guests also. All right. So with all of that said, let's get into this episode of the podcast. So why I've wondered basically ever since I wrote the article, The Best Kept Secret, Why People Squat Differently, where I highlighted the anatomical variations that exist in the pelvis, the socket of the hip joint, and the femur in terms of the size of the head of the femur and the version angle of the femur. And so I wrote that article, and people have debated for a long time, long before I wrote that article, but definitely after I wrote the article, about the optimal squat stance. And people will argue it needs to be 5 degrees toe out, 10 degrees toe out, or you need to have your knees pointed in a certain direction. You need some particular torso angle. And I take the stance of, look, people are built differently. We know that there are differences anatomically. Like, it's not a question. This is definitively just like a fact that there are differences in the orientation of the socket of the hip joint and the orientation of the head of the femur. And the head of the femur and the socket of the pelvis connect, they articulate to form the hip joint. Now, you can just imagine that imagine it wasn't a human. Imagine you just took a piece of metal that was like a metal joint. Wouldn't you expect that two metal joints that are positioned differently would move differently? Of course, right? That's just laws, that's just geometry. So I thought it was always strange that people still argued this. And there were some valid arguments, right? The variations in the version of the femur may occur in maybe 10, 15% of the population, which is like, 800 million people in the world, or 1.6 billion hip joints. So I think that's a lot of people. But I always thought it was kind of strange that people would argue this. And after thinking about why are people denying this? Why do people still dogmatically teach people to squat a particular way when we know there are variations? And I think you can boil it down to a couple of things. Number one is, what do you think a squat exercise is? Now, that may sound kind of silly, but what is the point of any exercise? What's the point of any exercise? What is the point of a squat? What are you trying to do? Now, if you can imagine a circle has a diameter, right? Like, there is a part of the circle that has the largest distance between 2 points, the diameter. Now, if a circle was positioned in three-dimensional space, pointing one way versus another way, the diameter, that line, would be in a different position, which means that if you're trying to gain the maximal amount of hip flexion, if the circles are pointed in different directions, which is really just the hip socket pointing in different directions, you would expect that you would have to move the leg differently, since in order to go through the vertical diameter of that circle, you would need to position the leg in a way to express that. So when I wrote the article, and when I think about squatting form, I think about squatting as a maximal hip flexion exercise, meaning the point of the exercise is to go as deep into hip flexion as possible, which means you need to have a particular stance to go through the greatest range of motion possible. That's just geometry. But because people have slightly, and sometimes more than slightly, I mean, the variation in torsion can be 20 degrees, maybe more in some cases. That means one person might need to have 20 degrees more of toe out to have their femur in their hip socket in the same orientation as somebody who has like a normal version angle. So that means that in order to actually get into the same joint position in the hip, that person will need to toe out 20 degrees more if they had retroversion of, let's say, 0, and somebody else had a version angle of 15 or 20 degrees. So you can certainly have that amount of variation. Now, if you think of the squat, and maybe I'm biased, right? Because I'm thinking about it in terms of like somebody who's doing Olympic lifting. If you're trying to do Olympic lifting, you need to be able to get down as far as possible to be competitive. In order to get down as far as possible to be competitive, you need to position your body in a way to maximally express the range of motion, which sounds really cool and fancy, but it really just means go into the largest distance in the circle, essentially, of the hip socket as possible. So if you take the position that you squat to get the largest hip flexion range of motion possible, then you can't base that on the position of somebody's feet, because the position of somebody's feet doesn't tell you the position of somebody's hip joint. And to gain maximal flexion in the hip joint, you need to have a particular stance. Now, I should add this because this could actually mislead some people. When you're deadlifting, when you're hip hinging, you're also going into a lot of hip flexion, and in many cases, end range hip flexion. Some people will actually get pinching in the front of their hip in the bottom of their deadlift because they're essentially pinching their hip into flexion because they have a narrow stance, and they probably need to toe out a little bit to externally rotate the femur and then put the head of the femur in the hip socket in a way that they can get more range of motion. So with squatting, it's maximal hip flexion when the knees and the ankles also bend into flexion. So let's just add that in to clarify. Maximal hip flexion with knee flexion and ankle flexion. And if you're doing it with load, you probably are trying to minimize spinal flexion, which brings up some other problems, actually. So I think that if you think about squatting that way, we're trying to get maximal hip flexion while you're also flexing the knees and the ankles and not bending the spine. You have to respect the anatomy, because at the end range of motion, the shape of the joint will ultimately determine which position you can get into. I mean, thinking otherwise is unrealistic, because why would you expect a physical joint to move in a way that goes against the structure of the joint? So I think when people argue about, no, it should be 5 degrees or 10 degrees, and I say I don't know how many degrees, because everybody is a little bit different. And so you're going to have to put people in a different position to maximize their particular architecture. I just don't think that that's the argument, right? I think people are in a different paradigm. If you think about it as maximal hip flexion, the argument dissolves, because obviously if there's variation, you're going to have to change people's position to get that maximal hip flexion. But I think if you're considering squatting as something other than a maximal hip flexion exercise with knee and ankle flexion and not bending your spine very much, maybe you think of it in terms of hypertrophy. Let's say you wanted to do squatting to build your quadriceps. Well, you're probably going to want to take a stance a little bit more forward, or toes forward, and maybe a little bit narrower, so that you get more your knees go farther over your toes. And that'll essentially make you have to use your quadriceps more to squat. And maybe in that case, you also elevate your heels, either on plates or with lifting shoes. So in that case, if your goal is to squat in order to hypertrophy your quadriceps, then yeah, you're not doing it as a function, with the function of squatting to get the maximal depth to catch a squat clean. So that could be a reason why you would disagree. And so if you think about it that way, and you don't think about it as maximal hip flexion, then everybody's going to disagree about what the squat stance is, because we're not even asking the same question. We're not even thinking about it in the same way. Or maybe somebody's thinking about it in terms of an application to a specific sport. Maybe you're squatting to play football, and you need to have a certain stance because you hypothesize that that'll translate better into a sport. So in that case, you're not trying to get maximal hip flexion. You're trying to have a little bit more sport-specific training. Or maybe there's some biomechanical research that I'm not aware of, that, and that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just means I'm not aware of it, that there's certain stresses on the knee, or there's certain stresses at the ankle or the hip or the back, where if you have a certain width, that it, long-term, maybe it's better for the joints. And that would be a valid argument. And then again, so if that was the case, and that's what you believed, then of course you're going to disagree with changing the stance, because you're basing a lot of your assumptions that, there's some biomechanical position that's better for the joints or something like that. And you're not thinking of it as a maximal hip flexion with knee and ankle dorsiflexion, a stiff spine lift. So you see how these disagreements could start to come up, because we're not really trying to get to the root of what are we really accomplishing here. What are we really trying to do with a squat? Because, we disagree sometimes, not because this person's right or this person's wrong, but because we're not even talking about the same thing. Now, take a power lifter. A power lifter, they are going to probably adopt a stance that allows them to break 90 degrees because that's how they compete. And that's not going to be necessarily the same stance that gives you the best depth. And you probably don't want that, right? Because if you can rely on the passive structures a little bit of the hip to prevent you from having to go below 90 degrees, then maybe it actually makes you a stronger lifter to put yourself in a joint position where the range of motion ends sooner, like maybe right below 90 degrees, so that you can lift heavier weight. So there's all this argument, and we haven't even clearly asked the question of how are you even defining why one stance is right versus another. And I believe that it's because we get tied into things that we've said or things that we believe, and we don't take the time to question, like, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong and this isn't the best way to do it? And that leads you to what's the best way to do it. Now, my opinion is this. I think that strength training exercises, that when we're lifting weights to either work on like technique or build strength or build muscle, all of those types of things, I want to protect the joint. I don't want to stress the joints in a way that could lead to long-term problems or that have some like biomechanically known mechanisms of injury that are possible, right? I want to try to minimize those things. So for example, if somebody squats and their knees drop in, maybe we don't want somebody to do that because that could potentially maybe translate over to them not being able to stabilize their hip joint well, and then their knees drop in when they jump and things like that, or they catch a squat clean, their knee drops in, they tear their meniscus or ACL or something. We don't want that. So when we think about squat, when I think about squatting, I'm thinking about, I want maximal hip flexion, but I can't be breaking those rules. I can't be letting the knees drop in, and I don't want the lumbar spine to flex very much because there is a mechanism for the lower back over time under load being bent. There is a potential way for the disc to get injured. If the knees drop in, there is a potential for that to translate over into some knee issues over time. So then if somebody puts themselves into a stance that allows them to get maximal hip flexion, but their knees don't do that and their lower back doesn't do that, I just don't know why that wouldn't be acceptable. And that's a question people ask me a lot at workshops and stuff, is like, is it bad though? And it's like, well, why would it be bad? Bad in what way? If you had to toe out, maybe it's bad for the hypertrophy development of your quadriceps, because if you had to, let's say you had to toe out, maybe you're working your adductors more. So maybe it's bad in that sense, but it's not bad in terms of you're going to have a problem with your hip joint. In fact, I think that a lot of people, especially if you're having pinching in your hip joint when you squat, like at the bottom, I think you need to explore different positions. I think that you might need to explore going a little bit narrower and more toed out, or a little bit wider and a little bit more toed out, as an experiment to see. As long as you're not bending through the spine, as long as you're not driving your knees in and coming off your heels, which could potentially put a lot of stress on the front of the knee, which if you're doing like explosive reps, I've seen people definitely get injured doing that. So there's obviously some stress there, which leads us to the question of, well, can't you just do any exercise and with any form, and your body will adapt no matter what you do? And I think that this conversation can go that way and become somewhat nihilistic in terms of, I call it movement nihilism. Movement nihilism is where it's like, well, and form doesn't matter, nothing matters. Well, depends what you're trying to accomplish. Of course, your body can adapt to so many things. You have to figure out like what's worth for, getting your body to adapt to. Like if you do a lot of pull-ups or Olympic lifting, or, just kettlebell work, you're going to develop calluses on your hands, right? Well, those calluses are useful because you're using your hands in a way that otherwise that skin might tear. So you could definitely squat in a way where you will stress your body in positions that you may not consider optimal, I guess. And then you could make the argument that, well, the body adapts. Yeah, it does. But what is worth adapting? Like, what things are worth trying to get an adaptation to? And so that's why it comes back again to what is your intention with squatting? What is your intention? What are you trying to do? Are you just trying to get stronger? If you're trying to get stronger, don't do it in a way that's creating pinching or problems in the joints. Because over time, pinching, where does that go? The pinching doesn't go away the more you pinch it. And I know there's a lot of people who have pinchy hips. I've met so many of you guys that have pinchy hips in the squat, and I toe you out 5 degrees and you feel so much better. And there is no mechanical problems at the knee or the back. In fact, a lot of times those get better. So then it's like, why would that not be better? And again, if you're dogmatic, you're going to say that it needs to be in a certain position because, it's written in some book or there's a study that shows a particular thing. But what is the reason that you're doing it? If you're an Olympic lifter, you want maximal hip flexion. And for me, that's what squatting is. It's a maximal hip flexion exercise so that you can work through the largest range of motion possible. However, I also believe that you should stop a little bit short of the very end range in certain people who are predisposed or who have a history of pinching in the hip. Because if it's a bony endpoint, if it's a bony lock of the head or neck of the femur against the socket of the acetabulum, if you bump into that constantly with load and you're holding your spine stiff, then the pelvis doesn't really rotate. So you're going to jam at that joint. And I just think that over time, that does not lead to good things for your hip joint, which is why I want to position people in a way that allows them to have the best range of motion in their hip and their knee and their back and control that range of motion and not bang into the bottom uncontrolled with a stiff back and go into end range flexion of the hip joint, where you start to compress the bones against each other or some of the soft tissues, especially if it's symptomatic, especially if it's pinchy. I might stop it a little bit short. And it's funny, right? We do a lot of the same stuff in the shoulder. Somebody has shoulder impingement. They have pinching or pain when they go up overhead. It's like, well, you have to not pinch it for a little while. And then you need to figure out, is there some mechanical thing that's making it pinch more than it should? And, what does the volume look like? And are you going in there, are you out here and you actually would press better here? We think about that in the shoulder. So why not in the hip? So if you get into a debate or an argument, or if you're confused about squatting stances, I think that you just have to think about, for you, what is a squat and why is a squat a squat? Why is a certain form better than another form? What are you trying to do? What is the whole reason this is an exercise? And maybe you'll agree that you think it's a maximal hip flexion exercise. Maybe you have a specific client or patient that needs to be in a certain stance for a certain sport or to hit a certain goal. The most important thing is to think about, why are you doing it? What makes good form good form? What makes bad form? And just understand that people are built differently. Some people are taller, some people are shorter, some people have long legs, some people have short legs, some people have torsion of certain bones that you cannot see. You can see somebody's tall. You can see if somebody has long legs and a short torso. Those are levers. Every bone is essentially a lever, and the ends of the bones connect and make joints, and those are the hinges. If the lever lengths are different and the hinges are different, the system's going to move differently to a degree. So why not respect that? Why not try to help people achieve the best things for their body, with an understanding that it'll look generally the same, but there might be small tweaks we need to make due to some differences. I never think that it's an excuse that people should not try to improve their range of motion, to work on their range of motion, to try to have better form. And again, I think better form is really when you can work through a range of motion without stressing the passive structures of a joint in a way that could be injurious to those tissues over time. A lot of times there's an argument that gets made too about needing to work through a full range of motion for an exercise to be effective. And a lot of people will make that argument like, oh, you're not doing it full range of motion. Well, there's a lot of things you do that aren't full range of motion. Think about this. Do you do planks? Is a plank a full range of motion exercise? Do you run? Is running a full range of motion exercise? Do you row? Is rowing a full range of motion exercise? Do you do push-ups? Are push-ups a full range of motion exercise? Like, is that really as far as your shoulder can go into an extension, or is it because your chest hits the ground? You go into a lot more shoulder extension in a dip. So technically, if you think of a push-up as being like shoulder extension, it's less range of motion. What about a lunge? Is that full range of motion, or does your knee hitting the ground stop you? So we do a lot of things that aren't full range of motion. And that's fine. And I think there's a time and a place to do less than full range of motion squatting. And I think that there's a time to do full range of motion squatting. And I think that there's a time that you could do narrower squatting and a time where you could do more toed out. But you really have to think about what are you trying to accomplish? And that'll help you answer whatever questions that you have with yourself or people that you're working with, is when you get to the why behind what you're doing. So I hope you guys enjoyed this short episode, sort of ranty episode about squatting and variations. Hey, if you guys enjoy Movement Fix podcast, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review on iTunes, just a rating. You don't have to write anything. If you want to write something, that would be great. If you could just click on the stars, that would be very helpful, because it allows other people to find the show, and that helps more people get exposed to material that I hope helps them help themselves and help others to keep their bodies healthy and functional, because keeping your body healthy for your life is a battle. There's hard days, there's great days, there's challenging days, there's ups, there's downs, there's tweaks, there's days where you can train hard, there's days where you get hurt, there's days where you feel great, and days where you don't feel great. It's a challenge. It's a lifelong challenge to keep our bodies healthy and functional. If we do that, it helps not only ourselves, but it helps everybody. Because if you're feeling great, you will radiate that outward into the world. All right, that's what I got for you guys. I'll see you on the next episode. Make sure to check out the website for the new article and version 2.0 of our hip and low back mobility self-care program. All right, I'll see you guys on the next episode.